In this episode of My First Quilt, we'll be creating the Mix It Up quilt, and I'll share secrets with you about how to add sashings and borders. Hi there, welcome to My First Quilt. I'm Sara Gallegos, and in this episode we are creating the Mix It Up quilt. This quilt is a lot of fun to put together because you can use a lot of fun fabrics, and it's fairly simple because it's based off of half square triangle units. So we've got two different blocks in this quilt. First, this right here, which is created by a 4-patch. You have two smaller half square triangle units and then two solid squares. The second block is this here, which is a larger half square triangle unit. And what I love about this quilt is that it comes together with sashings and cornerstones all throughout the quilt. So at the end of the show, I'm going to share with you the easiest ways to attach those sashings and keep all of those cornerstones lined up perfectly, and then how to properly add a border. Let's get started with our blocks. So we start by creating half square triangle units, and I have a tool that I love to use, and that's this marking tool right here. I can place this on my two squares. I've got my squares layered right sides together. You can flip that and you can see. And then you're going to place this tool from point to point down your squares. It's got dashed lines on it so you can see exactly where the centering mark is. And then you're just going to make a mark on each side of the tool. And that shows me exactly where I need to stitch. And then I've got perfect half square triangle units that are exactly 1/4 of an inch from the center marking. And then after you've stitched it, you're ready to cut. So I'm just going to line this up point to point and cut right along the edge. There we go. And now I've got my two half square triangle units that I can press open. So I've got two here that are already pressed, and we're going to lay these out with our solid white squares. I actually used a tone on tone. I think it's fun to use tone on tone prints instead of solids sometimes. And then you're going to place your half square triangle units. And the only thing that you want to be careful of here is I tried to not in the same block have maybe the same colors or the same print. I've got a couple different sizes of dots in my prints, and I did kind of vary that throughout my blocks. And then you also want to make sure when you lay these out that your diagonal seams are facing in the same direction. So we don't want it like this. We want those diagonals to be in the same direction. Now for the first block, all you do is sew together this 4-patch. So sew these together and then sew the 2 rows, and you've got your first block. The second block is very similar in that it is a large half square triangle unit. So we've got much larger pieces of fabric. So once again, you can use the same tool, mark, and then just slide it down and mark again. And then you're going to stitch on both of your marked lines, cut down the center, and then press open, and you'll have your half square triangle units that are significantly larger. So then when you create your quilt, you make sure that again that all of those diagonals are facing the same direction. So I think I had it like this. And you're going to be piecing together rows in your quilt that are your large half square triangle unit, one of your solid white rectangles, that's in your cutting instructions, and then your pieced half square triangle unit. And you create alternating rows. Let me show you what one looks like. This is what one of your completed rows is going to look like. We've got our large half square triangle unit, our pieced unit, and they're all separated by our white sashing strips. Now we've got to add the sashing strips that go on the long sides of the blocks. And I've got one here, and I did kind of audition the different colors in these little squares as I was choosing what I wanted to put where. So maybe, we've got 2 orange dots together. We can always rotate this right around and stitch it this way. They're still coming together. We'll roll with that. And you can kind of just play and experiment and see what you like. And now we're going to stitch these completed sashing strips onto our row. And I want to show you what I did here. On each of these, when I pressed toward the white fabric. So all of my seams are facing in, my seam allowances, on these border strips. And then on my cornerstones, I pressed out. And that's going to allow me to nest my seams on each one of those cornerstones. This is an important step. On this particular quilt, especially since you've got white fabrics and then bright fabrics and a lot of contrast, if you happen to have one of your seams off, it's going to be fairly noticeable. So you do want to take just a little bit of time to make sure that you nest those seams. Now you can kind of finger hold those together as you stitch, or you can always bring in a couple of pins. Anytime that you really want precision, it's not a bad idea to use a pin. Now, if you've seen many of my shows, you know that I kind of avoid them when I can, but for something like this, I think that it's important to use a pin. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this on, and then we're going to stitch it with a 1/4 inch seam, and the next step will be to add the border. So here I've got my row with my sashing strip on, and my points lined up really nicely. I'm really happy about that. Now let's talk about adding the border. We're going to pretend that this is the full size quilt. This is the full length. It's just not the full width of the quilt. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about proper border addition techniques. A lot of times people like to take a big long piece of fabric, stitch it on, and then just cut off whatever excess is left over at the end. And the reason that this is not the very best way to do that is because you do tend to kind of stretch either the quilt or the border, usually the border, as it's stitched on. And then when you go to quilt your quilt, you may find that it's not square at all. And a lot of times that you really see this when it goes on a long arm machine, because it may be fine in the first 3 sides of the quilt as you start at the top of your quilt and quilt toward the bottom. But when you get toward the bottom of that quilt, your long armer may find that they've got a lot of really puckered border fabric and have to take some of it off and reattach it. So it's really best when you're adding borders to your quilts to take some measurements. You could use a measuring tape. You could fold your quilts in half, but you got to remember that when you fold it, you've got a little bit of thickness at the fold with all of those layers of fabric and batting, so it's a tiny bit distorted. So it's best to lay it out on a flat surface and get out a measuring tape. You want to measure both ends and the center of your quilt to come up with kind of a common number. Hopefully it's fairly square and the number's close. If not, you may have to kind of average those numbers. And then you're going to cut your border strip to the desired width and the exact measurement that you came up with when you measured your quilt. This is the very best way to have really nice, square, perfect borders. Once you've measured that dimension, you also want to pin it into place. So I like to just place my border right onto my quilt, and I start on each of the ends. So I'm going to start on the right end here, and I'm going to line up the corners of my border piece and my quilt piece. I just kind of scratch it into place there. There we go. And I'm going to place a pin. And then I'm going to come all the way down to the other end and pin again. Now, if you had measured and one of your quilt or border pieces is just a little bit differently sized, when you pull it, as I'm going to do next, you can kind of ease in the excess. So what we're going to do now is just kind of give it a little bit of a tug so everything's nice and flat and straight. And then I'm going to pin the very center of my quilt. I love having a big flat surface to work on like this. And then I'm going to kind of pin again. There we go, right in between my last 2 pins. Good. And then I'm going to come on down here and pin between these 2 pins. And that's really all it takes. You don't have to add a pin every single inch for this. You just want to make sure that it's even at both ends, even in the center, and then secured in between your pins, you know, every 6 to 8 inches, just like I've got here. It's perfect. Now we're ready to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. And just like that, we have our nice, flat, straight border. And it matches really nicely at the end as well. So make sure that you take a few measurements from your quilt before you add those borders, before you cut the borders. Measure twice, cut once, and that's going to give you a really flat, perfect border and a nice square quilt. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning about the Mix It Up quilt block. I love this quilt. It's a lot of fun to play with these different sizes of half square triangles. And now with the tips you've learned today, you should have perfect sashings and borders on all of your quilted projects. Thanks so much for watching. My First Quilt is brought to you by Baby Lock, Free Spirit Fabrics, Madeira, and Hobbs Batting.